Well, welcome. This is the SATPAC Demo. This is the first demo that we've done in 20 years. And so the next demo will probably be done around 2042. Anyway, I'm Stephen Sachs, creator of the SATPAC program. And you may have noticed that I have a voice disorder, which is close to 50 years now. So unless something really dramatic happens in the next 15 minutes or so, this is the voice you're going to get. So what is SATPAC? Let me start with a story. In the mid-1990s, I was working for a large school district in Central California, and I was the ARTIC mentor, which meant that I would help other SLPs with their ARTIC kids. Anyway, what I noticed was that most were using picture cards without any real rhyme or reason, other than it was the target sound that was on the card, and that everyone was practicing really, really slow compared to conversational speech. So I thought there was kind of a disconnect here between what I was seeing and our ultimate goal, which is conversational competence. And that's what led to the development of the SATPAC program. So the program incorporates normal conversational competence parts, which include articulation, natural prosody at a conversational rate. And I also added some best practices, which are the use of facilitating contexts, non-words, and lots of repetitions, which lead to quicker remediation of the deficits. Now, there's 3 phases of the SATPAC program where the target sounds are using the establishment and practice phases, which use primarily non-words. And then once the student has developed this consistent motor pattern, then the generalization and transfer phase, which involves real phrases and sentences and conversation. There are 6 important elements of the SATPAC program, and I'll talk about each one. So facilitating context. Why do I use the word beat seat for S, for example? And the reason is that B sound requires no tongue positioning. The E gets the tongue wide, stabilized on the back molars, which is what we want for the S sound. The T gets the tongue tip up in the linguoalveolar area, which again is what we want for the S sound. And if you lengthen the duration of this T and E, you get the correct S sound, followed by the E and the T again. And so what I did was I developed these facilitating context words for every consonant sound and many of the phonological processes. Co-articulation. So in normal conversational speech, we always co-articulate. So my thinking is that when we're practicing, we should always be co-articulating. In SATPAC, the target sound will always be co-articulated, either post-vocalic, like the T is here, or pre-vocalic, like the S is here. Normal rate is really, really important. That's not to say that when you're first starting, you can use normal rate with your students because they don't have the motor skills to do that. But you need to keep in mind that that's your ultimate goal. So I'm going to share with you a story. When I was a young SLP, I was working with a couple of kids with frontal lisps, and we were doing stuff like, I like soup. And they would repeat, I like soup. And then the bell rang, and one of the kids said, oh, time for recess. See you later, Mr. Sachs. So we call that a clue because what was happening was I was practicing at a really slow rate, and the students' normal conversation was much faster. And again, we need to keep in mind that we need to build up and practice at a conversational rate. Natural prosody, and again, in conversational speech, we use natural prosody, and we should be practicing this in our therapy. This is list 6 from the practice phase, and I'll demonstrate the way it works. I model a boy bought a new beat seat, and the student repeats that. Then I say an incorrect sentence, putting the emphasis on the word that I changed. And then the student corrects it, putting the emphasis on the correct word. So I ask, I bought a new beat seat. And the student says, no, boy bought a new beat seat. I ask, a boy sold a new beat seat? The student responds, no, a boy bought a new beat seat. Anyway, we're using natural prosody, and this is a very powerful technique using these contrastive stress sentences in that we're taking the stress off the target sound, which is what we do in conversation. Non-words. There's 3 reasons why I use non-words. The first is that you can make minimal changes from word to word. So for example, in the practice phase, list 1, for the S sound, every word is seat, seat, seat. So the words are beat seat, mid seat, wait seat, vet seat. And I model those, and the student repeats them. The reason for that is what we're doing is trying to make this consistent motor pattern. And by using lots and lots of consistent repetitions, that's how you do it. There's also no negative associations with words like beat seat and mid seat, where if you're asking the student to say the word soap, for instance, the student has said that word incorrectly, thousands and thousands of times. And the placement for soap and the sound of soap, they all sound correct to the student. So you can avoid these problems by using non-words. Also, if you're familiar with the complexity approach, non-words are more complex. When you switch to real words after the student has developed this consistent motor pattern, then it's much easier for them to be saying real words. And finally, we get lots and lots and lots of repetitions of the target sound. So in the generalization transfer phase, we have these sentences. And again, by using a contrastive stress technique, like I'll say, Grace has a soft whisper. The student repeats it. I ask, Bill has a soft whisper. The student goes, no, Grace has a soft whisper. By using that technique, you're getting almost one correct target sound per sentence. I'm sorry, one target. Let me say that again. You're getting almost one target sound every second. So it's a really effective way to do therapy. And the way I see most of my Arctic kids is using RTI, seeing the students 15 minutes per week individually. And by using this technique, I can get hundreds of correct responses in a short 15-minute session. The SATPAC program has 3 phases. The first is the establishment phase, which is optional. And the reason it's optional is that as you're getting correct placement and using lots and lots of repetitions to do this and working up to a facilitating context word, then the establishment phase is basically unneeded. So, for example, if what I'm talking about is developing the correct placement for the S sound, you start with this eat, and then we go to eats, then eatsy, then beatsy, and beatsy, doing hundreds and hundreds of repetitions at each step. And so finally, when the student gets to beatsy, typically they're saying it pretty comfortably, and they can just go right into the practice phase. And this is what the practice phase looks like on the computer program. It's really the meat of the SATPAC program, or for you vegetarians, it would be perhaps the broccoli or the tofu if you're looking for protein of the program. Anyway, the way this works is there are 3 bars that you click, and then a drop-down list appears, and it has suggested facilitating context words for every consonant sound and many of the phonological processes. And in this case, we're working with a student with a frontal lisp. So we click on the word pizza, then it appears in this box. One of the features I like best about the SATPAC program is you can eliminate any sounds from your lists that you don't want. So in this case, we've eliminated the TH sounds because they're going to interfere with the student who is trying to keep the tongue back behind the top teeth. And we don't want them saying the sounds because that's the placement that the student is using for the S sound. Also, we've eliminated the R sound because the student can't say the R sound. So we don't want that in our lists. Then you click on the Create List button. We're looking for 80% accuracy on the first 5 lists at 140 beats per minute with the use of a metronome. And from that point forward, we don't use the metronome, but what we're listening for is basically a slow to normal conversational rate that sounds pretty natural. And this is what the lists look like. And like I mentioned earlier, in list 1, we have this seat all the way through. And all these lists are systematic in that they all follow the place manner chart going from front to back, and the vowel circle going from front to back. Now, the way this looks like using the SATPAC program is that you model the word for the student and the student replies. So here's an example. And this is at 140 beats per minute, which is a slow conversational rate. Beat sick.
Beat sick.
Mid sick.
Mid sick.
Wait sick.
Wait sick.
And at this time, I was using the word Pete sick, but I switched now and I use the word Pete seat. More or less, each as you proceed through the lists, they move further and further away from this beat seat facilitating context until you're getting very unusual contexts that become more difficult. And then finally, list 6 again, which I showed you earlier. From there, we move into, well, actually, I should mention that as we've gone through these practice phase lists, what's happened is the student has developed this consistent motor pattern. So they're using this correct S sound. And at that point, we move into the generalization transfer phase where they're done with the nonsense words. And we're going to use S and C list one, which involves phrases, short sentences, and longer sentences. And at this point, the student begins using a tally counter. And the reason for this is that, interestingly, as the students are going through these lists with phrases and sentences, they often don't know when they're saying their target S sound. And so by using a tally counter where they have to push on every time they say the S sound, that gets them scanning ahead, and it gets them so that they're anticipating saying the correct S sound. And by doing that, they will keep the tongue in the correct position. So we begin with phrases where we have a prevocalic and postvocalic S in every phrase, abutting against every consonant sound. So you can see we start with P and then B and then T, etc. Then we have the short sentences and finally longer sentences. When the student has achieved competence with those, we bring back the difficult TH sounds, and the student has to contrast the THs with the S and Z now. At this point, the student is ready to do that. And when they can go, the singer sang both songs and do that correctly at a conversational rate, then they're remediated. It's not unusual to finish the SATPAC program here. And what I'll do is just talk to the student, record them, and see where they are on 50 utterances of their target sound. If they're around 75% accurate, then you can say that they're functioning adequately and that they don't need any more direct therapy. However, if they're under that, then we keep practicing. And what we do at this point is we start working on some of their academics so that they'll, for instance, bring their reading book in and we'll work on their stories where they're using the tally counter. And we'll talk about their stories and they have to push on the S sounds. Anyway, like I said, I work with most of my kids in RTI. And so at this point, when they're using their target sound with 75% accuracy, I tell the parents that the student will still practice at home, but I'm not going to see the student. And then in a month, I'm going to recheck them. And we call these stability checks. And if they're still a month later at 75% accuracy or better, then we go 3 months with the student practicing, and then I will recheck them And if they're at 75% accuracy or better, then they're dismissed from speech because they have the skill, and at that point, they're not going to regress, but will continue to improve. So that's the SATPAC program. There are also 2 supplements which are really helpful. One is a CV list for kids who have childhood apraxia of speech. And these are usually the 3 and 4-year-olds who are really pretty severe. For example, this student only has the PP, MW, GT, and N sounds. So you exclude all the other consonants, and the student could say all the vowel sounds. So there's 4 lists. We start with reduplication, BB, meme, way, etc. List 2 has systematic consonants but random vowels. List 3, systematic vowels and random consonants. But again, these are just the consonant sounds that they can say. And list 4 is everything is random. What I've found is that by doing this very systematic approach, that my students with CAS have really improved using this method. Also, again, for the complexity approach, I've put in 3-element clusters. In this case, the word squam in my tribute to Elmer Fudd. And there are 2 lists, one systematic list and one with just random words using the SKW. So I've been using, like I mentioned, that I do most of my Arctic kids, and I have 15 years experience doing this with RTI. We've had 2 peer-reviewed journal articles showing the success using this technique, and that I've done this in the studies with S's and R's, and that most students, being around 70%, will develop their correct target sound in 5 hours or under. And I think this has really huge implications for the way we do therapy, in that if you can keep most of your Arctic kids out of special education and remediate their speech sounds in 5 hours or less, that you're going to save a lot of time by not putting kids into special education. And it's going to ultimately lead to large reductions in your caseload. So, due to its effectiveness, SATPAC is being used in over 2,000 school districts in the United States and other English-speaking countries in the world. And that's as of right now. If you have any questions, you can contact me, steve@satpac.com, or visit our website, I also have lots of free ASHA CEU webinars that deal in much more detail about SATPAC, and I talk in much more detail about remediation of S's, R's, and the other most common error sounds.